Hello again, I'm Matthew from thewetpen.com, and since I had a couple of requests, this is a video about how to do the Jinhao Zebra G-Nib conversion. This conversion is a very popular way to use Zebra G-Nibs that are intended for dip pens in fountain pens to get very soft, flexible nibs for writing with variably thick or thin lines. Before I start, let me say that I'm really no expert at this. My success rate is maybe a little better than 50%, but not a whole lot better. So take all of this with a grain of salt, and if you know a better way of doing this, please let us all know in the comment section below. Anyway, here's what you'll need. Bare minimum, you'll need a pen with a number 6 nib. Jinhao 750s are popular and cheap. You can buy 5 for $17 on Amazon, I'll put a link down below, but you can use any pen that takes the same size nib, like the Jinhao 650, 450, or 159, or a bunch of other pens from other brands, but I'd stick with something cheap. You'll need a pack of Zebra G-Nibs, of course. I'm using the cheap ones here, but the titanium ones are better. I don't know if they're easier or harder to work with for the conversion, but they will last longer in the pen. And finally, you'll need a pair of pliers, or better yet, 2 pair. These are some random needle nose pliers that I found in my toolbox just now, but any old pliers will work. Full-size pliers would probably work better. That said, there are a few more things that I think can make the process easier if you have them handy. A bit of tape can be handy, but more importantly, a sturdy pair of leather gloves will protect your hands and help you get a good grip. And maybe a hammer and a big drill bit. That's not as crazy as it sounds, but I'll explain more in a moment. So once you've gathered up your materials, we can move on to the first step of the conversion, and that is removing the stock nib from your pen. Before you remove it, it's a good idea to take a look at your nib and feed and get a good idea of how deep the feed and nib are in your pen's grip section, just so you know what to expect later. Then, removing the nib is actually pretty easy. The nib and feed just pull straight out together. So, put the feed in the crook of your first finger and grip it with your thumb on top of the nib, and with your other hand on the pen, just pull the nib and feed straight out without twisting. I use the edge of my second hand to sort of press against the grip hand, but you generally won't need any extra help. And when the nib is out, you can move on to the second step, which is to shape the G-nib to fit the stock pen feed. If you hold the G-nib against the feed like this, you'll see that the G-nib has a smaller radius than the feed, so there's a big gap between them. Our job is to flatten the G-nib sufficiently to make the nib sit flush on top of the feed. I'll show you a couple of different methods to do this. You can use one or the other or both, whatever works. The first method is to use pliers to either squeeze or bend the nib wider. If you compare the G-nib with the stock, you see that at the proximal end here, they're already pretty similar, but further away from the end, they appear to flare out a bit more. Generally, I'll start here, around the G, widening the arc here and then working my way towards the near end. If you want to just try to squeeze the nib flat, then chances are that the edges of the nib will get caught on the ribbing of the pliers. So if you put something hard like a penny under the nib, you'll give it a better chance of flexing out evenly. But even if you do that, I haven't found that squeezing works very well. Instead, I use 2 pairs of pliers, or pliers in a vise, and I grip one side with one pair and the other side with the other, and I just bend them apart, again starting in the center and moving down towards the end. Bend a little bit and then check against the nib, and then bend a little bit more and check again. Once the nib lies flat against the feed with minimal or no pressure on it, you're done. But I actually prefer a second method. This is where that hammer and drill bit come in. I use a 5/16 inch drill bit as a sort of anvil to shape the nib against. If you feel like it, you can use a bit of tape to hold the nib against the drill bit, but it's not necessary. And from here, you just pick up your favorite hammer and give it a few good solid raps. I don't recommend doing it with a camera between your workbench and yourself. You'll just end up looking foolish, as you can see. The drill bit is bigger than the feed, but the nib is springy enough that it won't really match the radius of the drill bit, so that's okay. 9/16 works for me, but you can experiment. If you want to do several nibs at the same time, this is the fastest way, I think. Then, of course, you need to check it against the feed to make sure that everything is working as expected. Here, it's looking pretty good. So finally, we move on to the last step, which is washing the nib and then installing it back in the pen. It's important to wash the nib because any oils on it will keep it from drawing ink smoothly. Soap and water, alcohol, nail polish remover, they probably all work, just make sure you use something. Line up the nib on the feed, about this far back to the last fin, and then locate the flat side of the hole in the grip section and the flat side of the plastic feed, and put them together. I get them held in place temporarily, and then I use a leather glove to push them in all the way, because they can be a pretty tight fit sometimes and you'll have to use a lot of pressure, and it makes it easier to grip and offers some protection if you slip. And from there, you just ink it up. You prime the pen a little bit by pushing a bit of ink into the nib, and you should be good to go. But sometimes it works, and sometimes it just doesn't. I don't know why exactly, but if it doesn't work for you, give it another shot. It will probably work the next time. And that's it for now. If you found this useful, please give me a thumbs up and maybe even subscribe if you feel like it. And I will keep working on more pen and ink related videos. Stay safe out there, everyone.